My dear Bram, I'm uncertain of your appreciation of my presence. At times, I feel that you might be entirely averse to me. At other times, I feel that I might be entirely averse to you. Perhaps then, your sole desire is simply to be me. Sincerely yours, Oscar Wilde. I'm only joking. Of course, I'm doing a hee-hee, I'm doing a haha. That was Charlie XCX. However, the frenemy relationship between Bram Stoker and Oscar Wilde has long been a subject of speculation. From claims that Dracula is actually a response to the Wilde trials to full-on fringe theories about a secret gay relationship between the two. The reality is actually messier than any avid RPF writer could imagine. Stoker and Wilde's lives not only followed, but also in a way reflected each other. And tracing the links and connections between them is truly a fascinating ordeal. So let's dive into how Bram Stoker stole Oscar Wilde's first love, how Wilde allegedly smooched Stoker's gay idol, and much, much more.
It's so confusing sometimes to be a girl.
Both Stoker and Wilde are definitely not the easiest people to make any certain conclusions about, but for different reasons. Stoker was noticeably reticent, like you could not get that man to share a feeling or an opinion, or at least commit them to paper and or preserve them. Barbara Balford even says that he dispersed memories as selfishly as an old crone ladling soup. Wilde, in contrast, would not shut the fuck up and would not stop talking shit simply for the sake of talking shit. I kind of respect the game. Combined with the fact that Victorians love to edit their lives through curation of letters and notes preserved, both of the author's biographers have had to do a lot of guessing and interpreting. Stoker in particular is guilty of discarding off or straight up destroying correspondence and documents. Only one of his Dublin diaries survive, for example. There's a ton of divergent readings and theories, and I will do my best to remain unbiased when judging them and try to get to the truth. Still, as the greatest philosopher of our time, Hannah Montana, said, everybody makes mistakes. Also, I will be using the word queer as like a catch-all umbrella term for everything not necessarily cisgender or heterosexual. Neither Wilde nor Stoker have identified themselves with any particular terms regarding sexuality or gender, and the Victorian era simply did not have the widely accepted vocabulary to describe certain experiences and attraction.
Wokeness hadn't been invented yet.
The tendency is often to refer to Wilde as strictly homosexual, because it was his relationship with the original evil twink Boise that led to his imprisonment. Yet I do not necessarily agree with this binaristic thinking. Throughout his life, Wilde has expressed affection for and infatuation with multiple women, often privately when a performance of heterosexuality was not exactly demanded of him. Pretty much all of the recent biographies of the author agree that Wilde's love for his wife Constance and his attraction to her were genuine. Let's not get into his misogyny, that's a whole another thing. Listen, the fact that Wilde was jailed for his homosexual relationships has established him as a gay icon in history, and his public image shaped the perception of gay men for like all future generations, and I'm no way trying to deny or erase that, nor am I trying to pander to the popular homophobic theory that Wilde was converted to homosexuality, because we know that's a bunch of bullshit. But I am wary of using very definitive and limiting language for people who didn't necessarily subscribe to it, so I'm going to be saying queer throughout the video. You can disagree with that, it's your right. It is my video though. This video would also not be possible without the discoveries made and timelines put together by researchers and biographers like Richard Ellman, Barbara Balford, and Daniel Farson. But I am most indebted to David J. Scull, of course, whose biography of Stoker deals especially thoroughly with the Stoker-Wilde connection.
It's so confusing sometimes to be a girl.
For how different Stoker and Wilde are perceived and remembered, they were surprisingly similar. They were both tall as shit, clocking in at 6'2" and 6'3", which is very surprising in a generation born during the Great Potato Famine and in its immediate aftermath. For reference on how freakishly tall they were for their time, the average height of man born in 1840s in Ireland was about 5'2" to 5'3".
That's a huge bitch!
In addition, both were Dubliners who found notoriety in London, Both were Trinity alumni. Both worked anonymously as journalists. Both strived to be writers. Both were prominent figures in the theatre circles of Victorian England. And both tried to marry Florence Balcombe. On 6th of August, 1876, Oscar Wilde sent one of his close Oxford friends a letter that read, "I am just going out to bring an exquisitely pretty girl to an afternoon service in the cathedral. She's just 17 with the most perfectly beautiful face I ever saw and not a sixpence of money. I will show you her photograph when I see you next." The exquisitely pretty girl is most often thought to be Florence Balcombe, whose family has just recently moved to Clontarf that year. Florence's life is not well documented, and what is preserved most often relates to the men in her life, so we do not know that much about her. The Victorians weren't exactly fans of girl bosses, and by all accounts, Florence was one. What we do know is that she was apparently gorgeous, smart, fluent in French, and not the biggest fan of motherhood. And 5'8", which was considered a great match for this fucking tower of a man. After she met Oscar Wilde in the summer of 1876, they went on a few dates and continued exchanging letters after Wilde went back to Oxford. Wilde was really into her, and one of the very few surviving art pieces done by him is a watercolor he painted for Florence while on vacation at the family Moitura house. It's not actually the picture in question, but it is the house. I couldn't find a digitized version of the watercolor, so you'll have to deal with this. Florence actually kept that watercolor with her until her death in 1937, saying that it creates much envy in the breasts of the Oscar cult. Oscar affectionately called her Flory and put down Florence as his favorite female name when filling out a question page in his friend's album. More to that, another art piece of Wilde's that made it to today is a sketch he did of Florence in 1877. That same year, he was rusticated at Oxford for a semester for missing a whole month of studies because he was busy chilling in Greece. And so Wilde headed back home to Dublin, writing to his friends about the stupidity of the Oxford dons and noting that Flory was more lovely than ever. The adoration was definitely not one-sided. In June or July, Wilde sent Florence one of his sonnets, to which she responded, "Your sonnet is sublime. We want to hear you read it yourself to us." That's how Victorians flirted. Hell, that's how lesbians flirt nowadays, you know? After 1877, there was a lapse in communication. It is unlikely that the correspondence just did not survive, because Florence carefully kept the letters that we do have. More carefully than the letters from the man who she actually married, but that is kind of beside the point. In this house, we believe in the right of every woman to never get over a situationship with a closeted queer poet. I personally support women's rights and women's wrongs. I'm half feminist on my mother's side, actually. There's a wide range of theories as to what led to this icy period, from Wilde catching syphilis to just straight up boredom. But what we definitely do know is that he tried to reignite the flame in 1878. In April, while on vacation in Bournemouth, he wrote to Florence, "My dear Flory, I send you a line to wish you a pleasant Easter. A year ago, I was in Athens and you sent me, I remember, a little Easter card. Over so many miles of land and sea, to show me you had not forgotten me." That year, obviously, Wilde received no Easter card and most likely no response, because Florence was being courted by another suitor, none other than Bram Stoker. We do not have any specific information on how and when Bram and Florence met, nor do we have any journal entries or correspondence leading up to their engagement. That's suspicious. That's weird. There's even speculation that they might have been introduced by Lady Wilde, Oscar's mother, which makes it even more messy. Point is, while Wilde is away, Stoker swoops in and presents himself as a way more suitable husband. Mind you, Wilde is 24, still at Oxford, in debt, traveling all around Europe, and just living his best, relatively carefree life. Stoker, 7 years his senior, already has a bachelor's and a master's from Trinity, and a respectable and stable job as a clerk in the Dublin castle. Adding insult to injury, all documentation points to the fact that there was no whirlwind romance or spontaneously ignited passion. These two were already aware of each other, if not friendly with each other. Stoker was actually a frequent guest at Lady Wilde's salons, had dinner with her quite often, and even spent Christmas with the Wilde family when Oscar was away. So when Wilde learned about Florence's new boyfriend, well, her new fiance, he decided to be messy. On Christmas 1876, Wilde actually gifted Florence a small golden cross with his name inscribed on it. And now, he wanted it back. So he wrote not one, not two, but 3 letters trying to convince Florence to return the necklace. The first one reads, "Dear Flory, as I shall be going back to England, probably for good, in a few days, I should like to bring with me the little gold cross I gave you on Christmas morning long ago. I need hardly say that I would not ask it from you if it was anything you valued, but worthless though the trinket be, to me it serves as a memory of 2 sweet years, the sweetest of all the years of my youth. And I should like to have it always with me. Though you have not thought it worthwhile to let me know of your marriage, still I cannot leave Ireland without sending you my wishes that you may be happy. Whatever happens, I at least cannot be indifferent to your welfare. The currents of our lives flow too long beside one another for that. We stand apart now, but the little gold cross will serve to remind me of the bygone days. And though we shall never meet again after I leave Ireland, still I shall always remember you at prayer. Adieu and God bless you, Oscar." Sorry, these letters always fucking crack me up. Spoiler, they would meet again. And oh, how they would. This letter is just so messy. Calling their relationship the sweetest years of all the years of his youth, demanding the cross back while also referring to it as a worthless trinket. Oh my god, love it. Florence suggested they meet at Bram Stoker's brother's place, to which Wilde responded, "Dear Florence, I could not come to Harcourt Street. It would be painful for both of us. But if you would care to see me for the last time, I will go out to the Crescent on Friday at 2 o'clock. Perhaps it would be better for us both if we saw one another once more. Send me a line and I will be there." So Wilde insisted on being as far away from the Stokers as possible, but the end of the letter is where he really goes for the jugular. "I will send you back your letters when I go to Oxford. The enclosed scrap I used to carry with me. It was written 18 months ago. How strange and out of tune it all reads now." Sending a note that he wrote over 1.5 years ago and carried with him all this time after the relationship is over? Petty, messy, iconic. Florence's responses do not survive, but in the third, final letter, Wilde emphasizes that meeting at Harcourt Street was out of the question. "It would have been unfair to you, and me, and the man you are going to marry, had we met anywhere else but under your mother's roof, and with your mother's sanction. I'm sure that you will see this yourself on reflection. As a man of honor, I could not have met you except with the full sanction of your parents and in their house." After humble bragging about his well-mannered upbringing, Wilde asks for the cross yet again. "As regards the cross, there's nothing exceptional in the trinket except the fact of my name being on it, which of course would have prevented you from wearing it ever. And I am not foolish enough to imagine that you care for any memento of me. It would have been impossible for you to keep it." And finally, he throws some shade towards his ex. "I'm sorry that you should appear to think, from your postscript, that I desired any clandestine meeting. After all, I find you know me very little. Goodbye, and believe me, yours very truly, Oscar Wilde." I find that reading out the letters nearly in full is important to showcase just how messy and petty Wilde was being. And fair. I would also be salty as shit if the girl I was courting ran off with my fucking frenemy. We do not know if Wilde ever did get his trinket back, and it has not resurfaced in either his or Florence's possessions. What we do know is that Florence and Stoker got married on December 4th, 1878, kind of in a hurry. Bram actually got a job offer from his idol, Henry Irving, who we'll talk about later, and he was running around like a headless chicken, getting ready to move to London. So the wedding that was planned for next year was moved way up for convenience's sake. The ceremony took place in St. Anne's Church and was a rather private event, attended only by close friends and family. As David J. Scow notes, among those not present was Oscar Wilde, whose home in Marion Square was only several blocks away. In April 2009, researcher Estelle Clements actually directed a dramatized reenactment of the wedding. This version did have a distraught Oscar Wilde, who emitted a loud, disapproving cough when the vicar asked if anyone opposed the union. That is where this absolute gem of a photo comes from.
When we were first approached by Dublin City Council to take part in One City, One Book, we had no idea of the kinds of things that we would start uncovering about the life of Bram Stoker. And it wasn't long before a trip to the archives had revealed to us a little bit of a love triangle between Bram, Oscar and Florence, and from there things just spiraled.
So, Stoker and Florence got married and moved to London around December 1878. Their marriage is surrounded by apocryphal theories and factoids, ranging from Florence's frigidity to Stoker's syphilis. Daniel Farson, Stoker's grandnephew, writes particularly hard for both theories and claims they are based on his interviews with Stoker's granddaughter. Covering all of this in depth is a task for another day, but the crux of the whole thing is that Bram and Florence led pretty separate lives as a married couple and were not remembered to be particularly passionate or romantic with each other. And don't get me wrong, judging by contemporary accounts, they got along very well and spent time and socialized together, but the way their dynamic is described is far from what we would consider to be lovers. Stoker himself shared that his new boss, Henry Irving, was surprised to learn that he was married, and that his wife accompanied him in his move to London. Now, all of this sounds very suspicious and very fruity to us, but in reality, this detached type of marriage was not that uncommon among Victorians. David J. Scow puts it well in an interview with John Edgar Browning. In Stoker's day, marriage was more likely to be a practical arrangement than a romantic fairy tale. Almost everyone got married, whether they were what we would call today straight, gay, or bisexual. The pressure to conform and have children was enormous. Many commentators have described Florence Stoker as a frigid wife, a modern pathological term that's fairly meaningless for a time when women were universally told it was abnormal and even degenerate for them to experience strong sexual desire. Bram Stoker, of course, had certain queer leanings and associations, as we'll discuss in later sections, but for the sake of this one, we just need to know that his lukewarm marriage was very much normal for the time. But you know what was not normal? The fact that by coincidence, the Wilde family moved to London pretty soon. In 1879, Wilde and Stoker continued to be active in the same theatrical circles, and there was no known communication between all three until one fateful day in 1981. On the 3rd of January that year, Florence made her first appearance as an actress, one of the extras in a crowd scene. That same day, Irving Terry, the leading actress of the Lyceum Theatre that Stoker worked for, received 2 crowns of flowers from none other than Oscar Wilde. He also sent a note that read, "I send you some flowers, 2 crowns. Will you accept one of them, whichever you think will suit you best? The other, don't think me treacherous, Nellie, but the other please give to Florrie from yourself. I should like to think that she was wearing something of mine the first night she comes on the stage, that anything of mine should touch her. Of course you think, but you won't think she will suspect? How could she? She thinks I never loved her, thinks I forget. My God, how could I?" The drama, the secrecy. Oh my God, they should put a picture of Oscar Wilde in a dictionary as the definition of the word messy. We do not know what Florence's reaction was, but oh God, what I would give to be a fly on the wall of that damn theater. Okay, so I wasn't sure if I wanted to include this, but I think it does add to the context of the story. So here we are, literally the night before the video goes live. There's a number of Oscar Wilde's poems that are theorized to be about Florence. Most of them are from his first poetry volume that came out in 1881, and there's no manuscript, which makes them hard to date and to tie to certain persons. That's why I'm saying theorized. Also because they're not dedicated to anybody in particular, which, as we'll get into the poems, you'll understand why. The 2 that I specifically want to mention are called Her Voice and My Voice, which describe the same breakup from different perspectives, and everything does seem to point to the narrator of My Voice being Wilde and the narrator of Her Voice being Florence. The she first declares love and dedication for someone and then disappoints them with, "Dear friend, those times are over and done. Love's web is spun." More to that, the lines such as, "I made that vow, swore that two lives should be like one," point possibly to engagement and not a simple romantic involvement. Ultimately, the narrative of both poems describes two lovers going their separate ways. Her specifically choosing boring reality, for lack of a better term. "I have my beauty, you your art. Nay, do not start. One world was not enough for two, like me and you." The poem My Voice is noticeably shorter and noticeably more bitter. It's kind of like the Victorian equivalent of being mad because you got ghosted out of the blue, I guess. "But oh, this crowded life has been to thee no more than lyre or lute or subtle spell of vials or the music of the sea that sleeps a mimic echo in the shell." So the timelines and the events, they do seem to line up, like the fact that the lyrical subject of My Voice is kind of dumped out of the blue by a partner who instead decides to pursue more grounded in reality and serious stuff and not art. And as I've mentioned, these poems specifically are most often mentioned when it comes to the discussion of Wilde's relationship with Florence. So I thought that it was necessary to at least outline this. Back to the video. At some point, Wilde seemed to finally let it all go, and in mid to late 1880s, the Wildes and the Stokers became friends again. Wilde was present at Florence's Sunday hangouts, and Florence and Constance were friendly and exchanged notes, and the families had also socialized together. Both Wilde and Stoker attended each other's premieres and crossed paths at dinners at the Beefsteak Room at the Lyceum. Wilde sent Florence copies of The Happy Prince and Other Tales and Salome in 1888 and 1893 respectively, with kind regards to Bram in both accompanying notes. In 1885 and afterwards, the Stokers were very pointedly silent about the Oscar Wilde trials. Stoker did not sign the petition of support from the Irish literary man, nor did he or Florence express any opinion about the event. But that's not the end of the story. Towards the end of her life, and especially after the death of her husband, Florence seemed to think about the long-dead Wilde more and more. This might have come from the fact that Ellen Terry, close to her own passing in 1928, found the letter about the two flower crowns from Wilde and forwarded it to Florence, captioning it, "By rights, this belongs to you." Florence proudly displayed Oscar's watercolor in her house and tried to arrange a meeting between herself and Vivian Holland, Oscar's son, whose last name was changed after his father's imprisonment. In the very last months of her life, she read O'Sullivan's book about Wilde and called it the best book she has read on poor O. This might have been rekindling of a forgotten flame, but Florence might have also carried warm feelings for Wilde, romantic or otherwise, with her throughout her entire life. After all, she carefully saved his letters, his sketch of her, and his little watercolor. Victorian norms surrounding marriage and propriety, of course, would not allow her to maintain a close relationship with Wilde, and instead demanded full dedication to her husband, whether she married out of convenience or practicality or not. So R.I.P. Florence Stoker. You would have loved the subway by Chaperone. You know, there's not that many situations where the concept of a throuple would solve 80% of the problems. But Zoolander and whatever these three had going on, they're definitely up there. My back hurts so fucking bad.
It's so confusing sometimes to be a girl.
Another passion that Stoker and Wilde shared was American poet Walt Whitman. Whitman's poems about manly embraces read quite tame by today's standards, but oh boy, were the Victorians scandalized by all the man balls mentions. They were so scandalized, in fact, that Whitman's selected poems from his poetry volume Leaves of Grass were heavily edited when they were published in England in 1868. They kind of caused a commotion, to be honest. God forbid you write a poem or two about man balls, huh? Stoker himself noted, "For days we all talked of Walt Whitman and his new poetry with scorn, especially those of us who had not seen the book." So, one day, Stoker meets a man carrying a copy on campus and asks if he can have it, and kinda gets obsessed with Whitman. like capital O obsessed. Very shortly after, my own opinion began to form. It was diametrically opposed to that which I had been hearing. From that hour, I became a lover of Walt Whitman. He was even part of the Whitman defense/fan club, which Stoker referred to as a little cult. They called themselves Walt Whitmanites and even tried to organize a trip to Dublin for him. But that went nowhere because Whitman's health was really in no condition to make such a voyage. So in 1872, Stoker decided to write his idol a letter. Oh my god, what a letter it is! First, he goes on a ramble about how the receiver should burn this thing before reading it, and identifies himself as a man living in an atmosphere prejudiced to the truths you sing and your matter of singing them. Then he glazes Whitman like he's clocked in at Dunkin' fucking Donuts and waxes poetically about them both being not like the other boys, and possibly even becoming literary comrades. It is only then that Stoker actually introduces himself, and it reads like a dating profile, I kid you not. If you care to know who it is who writes this, my name is Abraham Stoker, in brackets, Junior. My friends call me Bram. I live at 43 Harcourt Street, Dublin. I'm a clerk in the service of the Crown on a small salary. I'm 24 years old, have been champion at our athletic sports, Trinity College, Dublin, and have won about a dozen cups. I've also been president of the College Philosophical Society and an art and theatrical critic of a daily paper. I'm 6 feet 2 inches high and 12 stone weight naked and used to be 41 or 42 inches around the chest. I'm ugly but strong and determined and have a large bump over my eyebrows. I have a heavy jaw and a big mouth and thick lips, sensitive nostrils, a snub nose and straight hair. I'm equal in temper and cool in disposition and have a large amount of self-control and am naturally secretive to the world. The description of Stoker's appearance, of course, is included because both men were interested in pseudoscientific practices, phrenology and physiognomy. Physiognomy is then used by Stoker to glaze Whitman some more. I am a believer of the science myself, and am in a humble way a practicer of it. I was not disappointed when I saw your photograph. Your late one especially. Stoker goes on to detail his journey from an uninformed sheeple to an enlightened Whitmanite, confessing that he rereads the poems all the time. He also quotes some of his favorite lines, identifies himself as one who feels with you, and even writes, I have been more candid with you, have said more about myself to you than I ever have said to anyone before. Finally, before signing off, Stoker gives us another banger sentence. How sweet a thing it is for a strong, healthy man with a woman's eyes and a child's wishes to feel that he can speak to a man who can be, if he wishes, father and brother and wife to his soul.
Please come out of the closet.
This letter is the most personal piece of correspondence that we have from Stoker, period. And it is beloved by Stoker researchers for a variety of reasons. Most notably, it serves as the basis for speculation about the author's sexuality. Because, you know, it's just so... It would feel at home in the fruit aisle in your local Target, if you catch my drift. Wait, no, this is Victorian Ireland. It would feel at home in the fruit aisle at your local Tesco, if you catch my drift. And then Stoker did not send this. Instead, he kept it safe for 4 whole years. During said 4 years, he was still in the trenches for Whitman, and after a particularly passionate confrontation with prudish anti-Whitmanites, he sat down and wrote a whole another letter. Babe, wake up, we need to defend Walt Whitman. He first introduces the previous letter, and then writes, I wage a perpetual war with many friends on your behalf. Girl, we know! He then outlines the reason for finally sending the letter, the discussion he had that night at the Fortnightly Club, and then Stoker gives us yet another bomb before signing off. I only hope we may sometimes meet, and I shall be able, perhaps, to say what I cannot write. And then, after about 7 years of being capital O obsessed with Whitman and his poetry, Stoker shot his shot and sent both letters. Whitman's response was quite short, but understandably so, since his health was really not that great. But he was quite friendly. You did well to write me so unconventionally, so fresh, so manly, and so affectionately too. I too hope, though it is not probable, that we shall one day personally meet each other. To Bram Stoker, who was reared conservative in a conservative country, Whitman's poetry was a breakthrough. It was a revelation. But To Oscar Wilde, son of the poetry and literature legend Lady Wilde, aka Speranza, Leaves of Grass was nothing particularly shocking. After all, his parents openly read Whitman, and Wilde claimed to have known the poet almost from the cradle. He was pretty into Whitman, but not to Stoker's obsessive level. So it is all the more interesting that Wilde was actually the first to meet Whitman in 1882 as part of his first American tour, where he was kind of invited as someone to poke fun at. That's a whole another topic, let's not get sidetracked. On January 11th, 1882, publisher Joseph Stoddard, a close friend of Whitman's, informed him that Oscar Wilde has expressed his great desire to meet you socially. And a week later, Stoddard and Wilde were informed that Walt Whitman will be in today from 2 till 3:30 this afternoon, and will be most happy to see them. The two hit it off right away, and according to Stoddard's recollection, talked of nothing but pretty boys, of how insipid was the love of women, and what other poets, Swinburne in particular, had to say about these tastes. Whitman, by the way, treated his visitors to some absolutely rancid fucking wine, which Wilde gulped down like it was the gift of gods. And then the two retreated upstairs to Whitman's private room, if you know what I mean. And what I mean is that Whitman wrote to a friend later that Wilde is a fine, large, handsome youngster, had the good sense to take a great fancy to me. Wilde, for his part, boasted after their second meeting that same year, "I have the kiss of Walt Whitman still on my lips." Mind you, at that point, Stoker and Wilde were already well acquainted and active in the same artistic circles of London, so it is probable that Wilde bragged about the meeting directly to Walt Whitman fanboy number 1. aka Stoker, duh. When Stoker was finally able to meet Whitman in March 1884, it was in the company of Henry Irving and Thomas Donaldson. Not only was it a way less personal affair, but Stoker was also not afforded the same level of private reception, and most likely was not able to say what he could not write. Whitman seemed more interested in Henry Irving, but Stoker nonetheless found the poet to be all that I had ever dreamed of or wished for in him. And he finally did score an invitation to a more personal hangout, which he cashed in 2 years later. When the two met in 1886, they talked about Abraham Lincoln, of all people, and about the literary world of London. But most notably, Whitman later said the following about Stoker: "Henry Irving knows a good thing when he sees it, eh?" When Stoker met his idol for the last time in 1887, he tried to convince Whitman to sanitize his work in order to get more eyes on it, which is surprising, considering that he has previously been a stark defender of every man's right to man-boast poetry. Whitman, rightfully so, said that it was just a bunch of bullshit, and that cutting 100 lines would not be any sacrifice. So far as I am concerned, they might cut 1,000. No, I shall never cut a line as long as I live. It does not seem like either Stoker or Whitman left the meeting with the warmest of feelings, unlike with Wilde. It did not ruin their bond though, because Whitman actually left Stoker his notes on Abraham Lincoln. They're both obsessed with him to like a weird degree, but that's a whole nother topic. Yeah, so Whitman had delivered a lecture on Lincoln in 1886, and Stoker was unable to attend, so before his death, Whitman sealed the original notes in an envelope and sent it to a mutual acquaintance with the note that said, "Enclosed, I send a full report on my Lincoln lecture for our friend Bram Stoker." Just imagine. Put yourself in the shoes of Stoker for this one. Just like fucking imagine, you are obsessed with someone and your younger, bolder, and more annoying friend just goes for it and gets it like that, and then goes around bragging about how they smooched your object of adoration. And if that wasn't enough, there was also family involved. I also forgot to print out a little plaque that says family, but you know, if you didn't get it by this point, maybe that's on you.
It's so confusing sometimes to be a girl.
Long before the Wilde family name was associated with Oscar, his parents were kind of a big deal and the talk of the town in Dublin. Lady Wilde, also known as Jane Wilde, also known as Speranza, was a hostess to be reckoned with. She was a poet, a revolutionary, a true and tried Irish nationalist, in like the old-timey sense of the word. She wasn't like going to far-right marches. She was pushing for Irish independence and women's rights, translating literature from and to a variety of languages, and she contributed a lot to folkloric research. She was funny too. Some say she was diagnosed with bad bitch disorder. Oscar's father, Sir William Wilde, was, at least in the Victorian ideal, somewhat a match to this baddie. I obviously don't think so. But, you know, I guess. I so don't care for him, to be honest. He was like the eye and ear surgeon at the time. He was into the Victorian archaeology of the robbing graves in Egypt kind. And he also did some folklore research on the side. He also had 3 whole illegitimate children and was accused of rape by one of his patients. Yes. Moving on. Finally, there are also Oscar's siblings, Willie and Isola Wilde. The latter passed away at age 9, and that's why she's not on the wall. Like, we do not have a picture of her, nor does she play any important role in the story, and putting up her headstone on the wall feels kinda icky to me. Willie, on the other hand, was an active participant in many of the shenanigans. Willie's the older brother by only 2 years, and the relationship between him and Oscar went through a bunch of rough patches, but they were not rivals or enemies by any means. Sometimes you just cannot stand your siblings, you know. So why did I give you all this background? Because believe it or not, Stoker was involved with the Wilde family even before the whole messy friendship with Oscar ever started. Let's start with the connection between Bram Stoker and Lady Wilde, whom David J. Scal refers to as a surrogate mother of dubious moral character. Remember how Stoker confessed to Whitman that he was brought up in a conservative environment and felt liberated by Whitman's poetry? Lady Wilde and her literary salons had a similar effect on him. Stoker was a regular at the famous Merrion Square house. Lady Wilde assumed a somewhat maternal role. She was the cool, supportive, and hip mother Stoker never had. So by 1870s, Bram Stoker was there all the time. And in 1874, his dad wrote to him, "I suppose you dined with Lady Wilde, as usual?" The Merrion Square house is where Bram was encouraged to realize his creative ambitions, which his family dismissed. Abraham Stoker, his father, said of his friendship with theater people, "I don't think they are altogether desirable acquaintances to those not connected with their own profession. Under all the circumstances, I believe such acquaintanceship is better avoided." Bram, for his part, also got access to the crème de la crème of Dublin society, and an opportunity to network and elevate his social standing. Lady Wilde's patronage meant Stoker now knew everybody who was anybody. It is speculated that when Stoker applied for the job of city treasurer, Lady Wilde put in a good word for him, possibly in the form of a recommendation letter. To her son, Oscar Wilde, she wrote of Stoker, "He never gets into debt, and his character is excellent." She was, of course, speaking about the previous treasurer who was in a shit ton of debt, but considering that being in debt was Wilde's preferred pastime, her own son was also catching strays in that letter. And yet again, Stoker's own family was showing him no support. Abraham said, "Any trouble you may take in looking for the vacancy will only be lost time. An outsider has no chance." In 1875, when Oscar was at Oxford, Stoker was invited to celebrate Christmas with the Wildes, as Scal speculates, figuratively standing in for their absent son. The friendship continued even after Stoker and the Wildes moved to London, even though Speranza's salons were never what they used to be in Dublin. They crossed paths most often at the theatre, and in 1884, Lady Wilde said that Bram is very attentive and kind when I meet him there. There are less documented instances of Stoker's interaction with Sir William Wilde, but it is speculated that his stories from Egypt inspired the Jewel of Seven Stars, which revolves around mummies and resurrection. The Wilde's social standing depended, of course, on both William and Jane, but she was definitely the more sociable of the two. Willie Wilde, Oscar's brother, was, like Stoker, a member of the Phil, Trinity's Philosophical Society. Stoker was also most likely present at the 1875 celebration of Willie acquiring a law degree that was like a big party. And since Willie worked as a theatrical critic for a variety of papers, most notably Vanity Fair, the two were often present at first nights or generally mingled in the same theatrical crowd. Most interestingly, there is one letter that made it to the present day and that indicates a connection stronger than was initially suggested. This is not actually the letter, I just found a PNG of a letter. On July 16th, 1895, 2 months after Oscar Wilde was convicted for gross indecency and incarcerated, Willie sent the following letter to Bram Stoker. Bram, my friend, poor Oscar was not as bad as people thought him. He was led astray by his vanity and conceit, and he was so got at that he was weak enough to be guilty of indiscretions and follies. That is all. I believe this thing will help to purify him body and soul. I am sure you and Florence must have felt the disgrace of one who cared for you both sincerely. This text strongly implies that even though Bram Stoker put a lot of effort into erasing any signs of Oscar Wilde from his life post 1895, they indeed maintained a friendship throughout the years. A friendship that was strong enough to be known to a relatively estranged brother of Oscar. So they did not only share a first, that we know of, love and an adoration for Walt Whitman, but also family in a way. And there's still more. Let's talk about Victorian theater, Henry Irving, and Ellen Terry.
It's so confusing sometimes to be a girl.
If the camera's a little off, that's because I took a break. When describing Florence's marriage to Bram, David J. Schall writes, in the final analysis, they were both marrying Henry Irving. He's not exaggerating. Stoker's almost worship-like dedication to Henry Irving. Fuck, I'm covering him up. That's better. Stoker's almost worship-like dedication to Henry Irving was truly impressive. His closest friend, Hall Caine, called it an absorption of one man's life in the life of another, and the strongest love that man may feel for man. To put a long story short, Stoker had been fascinated with Irving ever since he saw him act for the very first time, and then many years later, Irving kind of courted Stoker into working for him at the Lyceum Theater. When Stoker got the offer, he quit his stable clerk job via telegraph, moved his wedding up, as we've discussed earlier, and practically ran to London on his own 2 feet. The only piece of kinda autobiographical writing of Stoker's that we have is personal reminiscences of Henry Irving. This is not just a Henry Irving biography, this is a chronicle of the work and relationship between Stoker and Irving, and the former's complete devotion to the latter. And also a few lies and embellishments here and there. Like, Stoker pretended he was way less obsessed with Walt Whitman. But, you know, what was he supposed to do? Put a link to his Whitman Stan account into the book? By all accounts, the work and relationship in question did not seem to be the most balanced. Irving is often described as despotic, and for a lack of a better term, a dick to almost everyone, including Stoker. Bram did not seem to mind the not-so-nice treatment, describing it as a friendship as profound, as close, as lasting as can be between two men. Irving also dominated Victorian theater. Like, he was the actor of his era. He reigned supreme at the Lyceum. And we as a society have always allowed male geniuses to be dicks if they had some semblance of talent. So people in Irving's life agreed to overlook his flaws for the most part. Stoker had been Irving's biggest fan since 1867, and when 1878 he got the opportunity to work in theater full-time, let alone for the man that he had not so secretly admired, Bram seized that opportunity by the throat. And Stoker's fanhood did not end when he got close to his idol. He would get into fights with theater critics, one of whom quipped, "Sometime in the 20th century, I trust well along in that century, Mr. Bram Stoker will be of much interest to the biographers of Henry Irving." Talk about a wrong prediction, huh? That was not that much of a dig, by the way. In his lifetime, Stoker was much more well known for his work in theater and journalism than his fiction, and even his obituary describes him as author, theatrical manager, close friend and advisor of the late Sir Henry Irving. Oscar Wilde, you know, being a successful playwright and a lover of theater, was, as expected, at the scene of the crime. Wilde had many actresses he obsessed over, but seemingly only one actor, Henry Irving. Wilde described him as a vivid personality and loved the same things about Irving that made him hard to deal with, like his stubbornness, refusal to compromise with the audience, and insistence on his unique artistic vision. Wilde even dedicated a sonnet to Irving, glazing him like Irving was an apple at Disneyland. "Thou trumpet set for Shakespeare's lips to blow. Oh my god, blow me like them." And like Stoker, Wilde lauded Irving in the press, writing, "Why should not degrees be granted for good acting? Are they not given to those who misunderstand Plato and who mistranslate Aristotle? And should the artist be passed over? No. Wilde was a frequent guest in the Lyceum Beefsteak Room, which was as much of a social club as it was a fine dining experience. And even more, he was one of the guests celebrating the 100th performance of The Merchant of Venice, where he read a sonnet to Ellen Terry. Who's Ellen Terry, you ask? Another baddie, overshadowed by annoying Victorian man. Where Irving was the actor, oh my god, my microphone is falling. Where Irving was the actor, Terry was the actress. She was the Lyceum's leading lady. Yes, the very same one that Wilde sent 2 flower crowns to for her and Florrie. So at the celebration, Wilde read his sonnet. Well, one of his multiple sonnets dedicated to Terry, entitled Portia, after the role Terry played. For in that gorgeous dress of beaten gold, which is more golden than the golden sun, no woman Veronese looked upon was half so fair as thou whom I behold. Wilde even sent Terry a copy of his first fail of a play, inscribing, "Perhaps someday I shall be fortunate enough to write something worthy of your playing." In 1883, when the Lyceum was embarking on its first US tour, Wilde was actually one of the people seeing the staff and actors off from Liverpool. Terry and Irving, who were lovers, by the way, were both quite taken with Wilde. Irving admired his almost childlike adoration of classic theater, and Terry wrote to Wilde about The Happy Prince and other stories that he was at his best. After Wilde's first trial, a mysterious veiled woman came to drop off a bouquet of violets to show support. It is theorized that Terry was behind the veil. There was an anonymous note that accompanied the flowers, but everyone kind of knew that that was from Irving and Terry. Terry, additionally, was one of the few people to see Wilde in his final year. When she visited Paris in 1900 with Amy Lowther, another dear friend of Oscar's, they spotted him staring through a window of a patisserie. Evidently, at that point, Wilde could not afford to treat himself as often as he was used to, and according to himself, often went hungry. The 2 women invited Wilde to eat with them, and Terry wrote about how she was glad that his spark was not completely gone, but that was the last time either of them saw Oscar. Irving and Terry represent yet another aspect where Stoker and Wilde's lives intertwined, namely Victorian theater. It seems like wherever the 2 went, they could not help but end up in each other's business. So let's finally bring this all together, examine the few direct connections between Stoker and Wilde, and discuss some of the more popular myths surrounding them.
It's so confusing sometimes to be a girl.
Yeah, what the title says. It's not. The Wilde-sized hole in Stoker's writing and correspondence is evident. Still, through surviving letters, other people's accounts, and autobiographical documents such as Stoker's book about Irving, we can claim with a high degree of certainty that the 2 were friends, or at the very least good acquaintances. There is no consensus as to when Wilde and Stoker first met. Most likely it was at the Marion Square house at one of the salons. David J. Scow specifically places it around 1871, when Oscar would be matriculating at Trinity. But even if we assume that the 2 only met when Wilde had already been a student for a while, that gives us a pretty lengthy period of about a quarter century. Like, I haven't even been alive for that long, my god. Both Wilde and Stoker were members of Trinity's Philosophical Society, or simply the Phil. There are claims that Stoker actually proposed Wilde's candidacy for membership, but Paul Murray rebukes them in From the Shadow of Dracula, pointing instead to Charles Arundel and Wilde's brother Willie. Oscar Wilde's participation in the Phil notably was known only by his absence. The only piece of direct correspondence between the 2 that survives is a note of surprising banality. It reads, "My dear Bram, my wife is not very well and has gone to Brighton for 10 days rest, but I will be happy to come to supper on the 26th myself. Sincerely yours, Oscar Wilde." The Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, where the letter is kept, calls it undated. Yet in the complete letters of Oscar Wilde, Holland and Hart Davis point out that, in another hand, the note is dated 1889. Gwennon Parsons from the aforementioned trust explains why it is not the content of the note that matters, but the details. The only clue we have as to when it was written or sent is that Wilde mentions towards the end, the 26th, though not the month or the year. Presumably, this meant he expected the letter to arrive with Stoker quickly, perhaps within the same day. The note also comes with a small envelope that has no stamp, meaning it could have been delivered in person by Wilde himself or by a servant. It is a very simple note, and the simplicity is what intrigues me the most. If it were a note between any other two people, it may not be of immediate importance, but half an exchange between two of the most famous writers of the 19th century is enigmatic to say the least, and yet it is merely about supper. Parsons argues that the letter is a significant marker in Wilde's life, one that represents the before the trials. I, additionally, would argue that it is also a significant marker in Wilde and Stoker's relationship. The letter's casual tone is what makes it remarkable in this context, but even though it answers some questions, it actually raises even more. Was this a regular occurrence? Was Wilde invited to Stoker's house or to the beefsteak room at the Lyceum? Was Florence there? Or was it just like a sausage fest? The after of Wilde's trials is characterized by Stoker going through the motions to erase any mentions of his disgraced friend. Even though Stoker dedicates multiple pages of Irving's biography to just listing the names of remarkable theater figures, Oscar Wilde is nowhere to be found. Stoker did not sign the petition for Wilde's release, nor had he sent a note of support to his friend among all the chaos and tragedy. There is speculation that Stoker secretly visited Wilde and brought him some money when the latter was in exile after his release. Palmer explains, and Stoker heard the story from her mother, who was on good terms with her mother-in-law, presumably the original source. The evidence is, however, lacking. Like, Wilde sent many letters begging his friends for money, and we don't have one addressed to the Stokers, and there are no journal entries or correspondence that could back up the claim. But, you know, it is a possibility. Talia Schafer's influential paper, A Wild Desire Took Me, claims that Stoker started writing Dracula in 1895, months after the Wilde scandal broke. And so the book is best examined in that context. Dracula explores Stoker's fear and anxiety as a closeted homosexual man during Oscar Wilde's trial. Let me tell you something. That is just straight up not true. Yeah, that did not happen. Like, don't get me wrong. Schafer did an impressive amount of research, and the essay brings up many great points and interesting parallels, but Stoker started working on Dracula roughly around 1890 and already had the plot outlined around 92-93. That is not to say that his preoccupations with sexuality and gender never bled through into any of his literature, but that is to say that Dracula being a reaction to the Oscar Wilde trials is quite unlikely. What is likely, however, is that Stoker had other concerns in mind. His closest friend, Hal Caine, said that he took no vain view of his efforts as an author. He wrote his books to sell. He had no higher aim. Considering this, David J. Scull concludes, in a final analysis, the most frightening thing about Dracula is the strong probability that it meant far less to Bram Stoker than it has come to mean to us. There is no doubt that Wilde's conviction influenced Stoker's writing, yet we cannot be sure to what degree. Remember, that man was stingy when it came to sharing his feelings and opinions. We do know that Stoker, who championed Whitman's man-boast poetry in his university days and relished in Victorian's homosocial and queer-leaning theater circles, seemed to make a conservative turn towards the end of his life. Most famous examples are, of course, his essays on the necessity of censorship, one of which claimed that, in the matter of the general welfare of the public, the censorship of the drama is based on the necessity of perpetually combating human weakness. The weakness is of two kinds, or rather in two forms: the weakness of the great mass of people who form audiences, and of those who are content to do base things in the way of catering for these base appetites. This, combined with Stoker's reaction to Wilde's trials, or rather a lack thereof, is often interpreted as an attempt to whitewash Stoker's allegedly disguised sexuality. And this, at least to me, certainly holds weight. Stoker's strongest feelings were for the man in his life. He was part of the largely queer Whitman fan club. His letter to Whitman certainly does read like an attempt at a if you know, you know moment. Stoker's work in theater brought him even closer to contemporary queer culture, where homosexual and homoromantic relationships were an open secret. Just like his friend Oscar Wilde's relationship with man, there is much more pointing to this reading of Stoker's life, but in particular, his letter identifying him as having woman's eyes is reminiscent of the popular at the time inversion theory. What is inversion theory, you ask? Basically, it claimed that if you were queer, you actually weren't. The problem was that you had the soul of the opposite sex, and your soul is actually straight. So congrats on that. From the 21st century perspective, we consider this a bunch of bullshit, and we know that that's really not how sexuality or attraction work, but that was the idea people used to articulate and express themselves at the time. So Stoker's self-described woman's eyes definitely suggest a queer perspective. So if we assume that Stoker was, at least to some degree, queer and conscious of his queerness, his friendship with Wilde becomes even more complicated. Ever since Stoker was a Trinity student, the Wilde family represented what he did not have: social standing, connections, money, freedom of expression, and a creative atmosphere. Wilde's open, at least for the time, assertion of his queerness, and especially his very public relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas, Boise, might have added insult to injury. Where Stoker was keeping his cards close to his chest at all times, Wilde was loud even when talking about the love that dare not speak its name. From Wilde's perspective, Stoker might have been a representation of the safe lifestyle he could not lead. Stable job, limited degree of creative involvement, writing to earn money rather than just for writing's sake, and constant upkeep of the facade of normalcy and Victorian propriety. And yet, the two just couldn't seem to get away from each other. They would meet at every other first night at London theaters, and there was the whole Oscar-Florence relationship, and they were both Irishmen trying to establish themselves in London, and so on and so forth. So that is why I insist on employing a girl so confusing lens. Sadly, Wilde and Stoker never did work it out on their remix. This is a fascinating topic to explore, but much of it still hinges on speculation. If Victorians loved to edit their lives through careful curation of journals and correspondence, Stoker was definitely editor-in-chief. It is honestly quite tragic that we can never know the true extent of the friendship and drama between Dublin's brightest literary and theatrical sons, or in the words of one of modernity's greatest poets, it's so confusing sometimes to be a girl.
It's so confusing sometimes to be a girl.
So, when I went to Dublin this summer, I was A, hate crimed by the British who kept insisting I was American, and B, able to fully nerd out when it came to both these iconic authors. And while on that trip, I remembered a silly TikTok edit about Wilde and Stoker. I'll put it somewhere right here. Sadly, the account seems to have been wiped, or maybe they just changed their username. But the point is, I cannot link the original for you, even though it contributed a lot to my desire to make this video. So in case you know the OG editor, or if you are the OG editor, please let me know and I will credit them or you in the description. Researching this has been a very welcome break and a distraction from some of the more grim and disturbing shit I have to work with for university stuff. And I'm really grateful for this hobby and for the small audience that I've gathered here. So yeah, pop over to my Patreon for extra stuff, and thank you for watching. Also, I really hope everybody likes my wall. I spent a lot of time on that. I made a whole graphic before I started filming. This is one of my proudest creations, to be honest.